Our crossing was thus made practicable without loss. When we reached a safe position, I instructed my little command again to carry their arms at a trail, not to fire at the enemy until they were ordered, and to move very cautiously following me until the San Cosme road was reached. We would then be on the flank of the men serving the gun on the road, and with no obstruction between us and them. When we reached the southwest corner of the enclosure before described, I saw some United States troops pushing north through a shallow ditch nearby, who had come up since my reconnaissance. This was the company of Captain Horace Brooks of the artillery, acting as infantry. I explained to Brooks briefly what I had discovered and what I was about to do. He said, as I knew the ground and he did not, I might go on and he would follow. As soon as we got on the road leading to the city, the troops serving the gun on the parapet retreated, and those on the rooftops nearby followed. Our men went after them in such close pursuit, the troops we had left under the arches joining, that a second line across the road, about halfway between the first and the garita, was carried. No reinforcements had yet come up except Brooks's company, and the position we had taken was too advanced to be held by so small a force. It was given up, but retaken later in the day, with some loss. Worth's command gradually advanced to the front now open to it. Later in the day, in reconnoitring, I found a church off to the south of the road, which looked to me as if the belfry would command the ground back of the Garita San Cosme. I got an officer of the voltigeur, with a mountain howitzer and men to work it, to go with me. The road being in possession of the enemy, we had to take the field to the south to reach the church. This took us over several ditches breast-deep in water and grown up with water plants. These ditches, however, were not over 8 or 10 feet in width. The howitzer was taken to pieces and carried by the men to its destination. When I knocked for admission, a priest came to the door who, while extremely polite, declined to admit us. With the little Spanish then at my command, I explained to him that he might save property by opening the door, and he certainly would save himself from becoming a prisoner for a time at least. And besides, I intended to go in whether he consented or not. He began to see his duty in the same light that I did and opened the door, though he did not look as if it gave him special pleasure to do so. The gun was carried to the belfry and put together. We were not more than 200 or 300 yards from San Cosme. The shots from our little gun dropped in upon the enemy and created great confusion. Why they did not send out a small party and capture us, I do not know. We had no infantry or other defences besides our one gun. The effect of this gun upon the troops about the gate of the city was so marked that General Worth saw it from his position. He was so pleased that he sent a staff officer, Lieutenant Pemberton, later Lieutenant General commanding the defences of Vicksburg, to bring me to him. He expressed his gratification at the services the howitzer in the church steeple was doing, saying that every shot was effective, and ordered a captain of voltigeurs to report to me with another howitzer to be placed along with the one already rendering so much service. I could not tell the general that there was not room enough in the steeple for another gun, because he probably would have looked upon such a statement as a contradiction from a second lieutenant. I took the captain with me, but did not use his gun. The night of the 13th of September was spent by the troops under General Worth in the houses near San Cosme, and in line confronting the general line of the enemy across to Belen. The troops that I was with were in the houses north of the road leading into the city, and were engaged during the night in cutting passageways from one house to another towards the town. During the night, Santa Anna, with his army, except the deserters, left the city. He liberated all the convicts confined in the town, hoping, no doubt, that they would inflict upon us some injury before daylight. But several hours after Santa Anna was out of the way, the city authorities sent a delegation to General Scott to ask, if not demand, an armistice respecting church property, the rights of citizens, and the supremacy of the city government in the management of municipal affairs. General Scott declined to trammel himself with conditions, but gave assurances that those who chose to remain within our lines would be protected so long as they behaved themselves properly. General Quitman had advanced along his line very successfully on the 13th, so that at night his command occupied nearly the same position at Belen that Worth's troops did about San Cosme. After the interview above related between General Scott and the City Council, orders were issued for the cautious entry of both columns in the morning. The troops under Worth were to stop at the Alameda, a park near the west end of the city. Quitman was to go directly to the plaza and take possession of the palace, a mass of buildings on the east side in which Congress has its sessions, the national courts are held, the public offices are all located, the president resides, and much room is left for museums, receptions, etc. This is the building generally designated as the Halls of the Montezumas. On entering the city, the troops were fired upon by the released convicts and possibly by deserters and hostile citizens. The streets were deserted, and the place presented the appearance of a city of the dead, except for this firing by unseen persons from housetops, windows, and around corners. In this firing, the lieutenant colonel of my regiment, Garland, was badly wounded. Lieutenant Sidney Smith, of the 4th Infantry, was also wounded mortally. He died a few days after, and by his death I was promoted to the grade of first lieutenant. I had gone into the Battle of Palo Alto in May 1846, a second lieutenant, and I entered the City of Mexico 16 months later with the same rank, after having been in all the engagements possible for any one man, and in a regiment that lost more officers during the war than it ever had present at any one engagement. My regiment lost 4 commissioned officers, all senior to me, by steamboat explosions during the Mexican War. The Mexicans were not so discriminating. They sometimes picked off my juniors. General Scott soon followed the troops into the city, in state. I wonder that he was not fired upon, but I believe he was not. At all events, he was not hurt. He took quarters at first in the halls of the Montezumas, and from there issued his wise and discreet orders for the government of a conquered city, and for suppressing the hostile acts of liberated convicts already spoken of, orders which challenge the respect of all who study them. Lawlessness was soon suppressed, and the City of Mexico settled down into a quiet, law-abiding place. The people began to make their appearance upon the streets without fear of the invaders. Shortly afterwards, the bulk of the troops were sent from the city to the villages at the foot of the mountains, 4 or 5 miles to the south and southwest. Whether General Scott approved of the Mexican War and the manner in which it was brought about, I have no means of knowing. His orders to troops indicate only a soldierly spirit, with probably a little regard for the perpetuation of his own fame. On the other hand, General Taylor's, I think, indicate that he considered the administration accountable for the war, and felt no responsibility resting on himself further than for the faithful performance of his duties. Both generals deserve the commendations of their countrymen, and to live in the grateful memory of this people to the latest generation. Earlier in this narrative I have stated that the plain, reached after passing the mountains east of Perote, extends to the cities of Puebla and Mexico. The route travelled by the army before reaching Puebla goes over a pass in a spur of mountain coming up from the south. This pass is very susceptible of defence by a smaller against a larger force. Again, the highest point of the roadbed between Vera Cruz and the City of Mexico is over Rio Frio Mountain, which also might have been successfully defended by an inferior against a superior force. But by moving north of the mountains, and about 30 miles north of Puebla, both of these passes would have been avoided. The road from Perote to the City of Mexico by this latter route is as level as the prairies in our west. Arriving due north from Puebla, troops could have been detached to take possession of that place, and then proceeding west with the rest of the army, no mountain would have been encountered before reaching the City of Mexico. It is true this road would have brought troops in by Guadalupe, a town, church, and detached spur of mountain about 2 miles north of the capital, all bearing the same general name. And at this point Lake Texcoco comes near to the mountain, which was fortified both at the base and on the sides. But troops could have passed north of the mountain and come in only a few miles to the northwest, and so flanked the position, as they actually did on the south. It has always seemed to me that this northern route to the City of Mexico would have been the better one to have taken. But my later experience has taught me two lessons. First, that things are seen plainer after the events have occurred. Second, that the most confident critics are generally those who know the least about the matter criticized. I know just enough about the Mexican War to approve heartily of most of the generalship, but to differ with a little of it. It is natural that an important city like Puebla should not have been passed with contempt. It may be natural that the direct road to it should have been taken, but it could have been passed, its evacuation ensured and possession acquired without danger of encountering the enemy in intricate mountain defiles. In this same way, the city of Mexico could have been approached without any danger of opposition, except in the open field. But General Scott's successes are an answer to all criticism. He invaded a populous country, penetrating 260 miles into the interior, with a force at no time equal to one half of that opposed to him. He was without a base. The enemy was always entrenched, always on the defensive. Yet he won every battle. He captured the capital and conquered the government. Credit is due to the troops engaged, it is true, but the plans and the strategy were the general's. I had now made marches and been in battle under both General Scott and General Taylor. The former divided his force of 10,500 men into 4 columns, starting a day apart, in moving from Puebla to the capital of the nation, when it was known that an army more than twice as large as his own stood ready to resist his coming. The road was broad and the country open except in crossing the Rio Frio mountain. General Taylor pursued the same course in marching toward an enemy. He moved even in smaller bodies. I never thought at the time to doubt the infallibility of these two generals in all matters pertaining to their profession. I supposed they moved in small bodies, because more men could not be passed over a single road on the same day with their artillery and necessary trains. Later I found the fallacy of this belief. The rebellion, which followed as a sequence to the Mexican War, never could have been suppressed if larger bodies of men could not have been moved at the same time than was the custom under Scott and Taylor. The victories in Mexico were, in every instance, over vastly superior numbers. There were 2 reasons for this. Both General Scott and General Taylor had such armies as are not often got together. At the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, General Taylor had a small army, but it was composed exclusively of regular troops, under the best of drill and discipline. Every officer, from the highest to the lowest, was educated in his profession, not at West Point necessarily, but in the camp, in garrison, and many of them in Indian wars. The rank and file were probably inferior, as material out of which to make an army, to the volunteers that participated in all the later battles of the war. But they were brave men, and then drill and discipline brought out all there was in them. A better army, man for man, probably never faced an enemy than the one commanded by General Taylor in the earliest 2 engagements of the Mexican War. The volunteers who followed were of better material, but without drill or discipline at the start. They were associated with so many disciplined men and professionally educated officers that when they went into engagements it was with a confidence they would not have felt otherwise. They became soldiers themselves almost at once. All these conditions we would enjoy again in case of war. The Mexican army of that day was hardly an organization. The private soldier was picked up from the lower class of the inhabitants when wanted. His consent was not asked. He was poorly clothed, worse fed, and seldom paid. He was turned adrift when no longer wanted. The officers of the lower grades were but little superior to the men. With all this, I have seen as brave stands made by some of these men as I have ever seen made by soldiers. Now Mexico has a standing army larger than that of the United States. They have a military school modelled after West Point. Their officers are educated and, no doubt, generally brave. The Mexican War of 1846-8 would be an impossibility in this generation. The Mexicans have shown a patriotism which it would be well if we would imitate in part, but with more regard to truth. They celebrate the anniversaries of Chapultepec and Molino del Rey as of very great victories. The anniversaries are recognized as national holidays. At these 2 battles, while the United States troops were victorious, it was at very great sacrifice of life compared with what the Mexicans suffered. The Mexicans, as on many other occasions, stood up as well as any troops ever did. The trouble seemed to be the lack of experience among the officers, which led them after a certain time to simply quit, without being particularly whipped, but because they had fought enough. Their authorities of the present day grow enthusiastic over their theme when telling of these victories, and speak with pride of the large sum of money they forced us to pay in the end. With us, now 20 years after the close of the most stupendous war ever known, we have writers who profess devotion to the nation, engaged in trying to prove that the Union forces were not victorious. Practically, they say, we were slashed around from Donelson to Vicksburg and to Chattanooga, and in the east from Gettysburg to Appomattox, when the physical rebellion gave out from sheer exhaustion. There is no difference in the amount of romance in the two stories. I would not have the anniversaries of our victories celebrated, nor those of our defeats made fast days and spent in humiliation and prayer. But I would like to see truthful history written. Such history will do full credit to the courage, endurance, and soldierly ability of the American citizen, no matter what section of the country he hailed from, or in what ranks he fought. The justice of the cause which in the end prevailed will, I doubt not, come to be acknowledged by every citizen of the land in time. For the present, and so long as there are living witnesses of the great war of sections, there will be people who will not be consoled for the loss of a cause which they believed to be holy. As time passes, people, even of the South, will begin to wonder how it was possible that their ancestors ever fought for or justified institutions which acknowledged the right of property in man. After the fall of the capital and the dispersal of the government of Mexico, it looked very much as if military occupation of the country for a long time might be necessary. General Scott immediately commenced the preparation of orders, regulations, and laws in anticipation of this situation. His aim was to ensure that the country would bear all the expenses of the occupation without burdening the people visibly with the army's presence. His strategy involved imposing a direct tax on the individual states and collecting a duty on all imports at the ports open to trade. Throughout the war, private property had not been seized for either army or individual use without full compensation, and this policy was to be maintained. Initially, there weren't enough troops in the Valley of Mexico to occupy many points. However, with the absence of any significant organized enemy force, reinforcements could be obtained from the Rio Grande, and new volunteers were arriving from Vera Cruz. Military control was established over Cuernavaca, Toluca, and Pachuca, along with Vera Cruz, Xalapa, Orizaba, and Puebla already being under U.S. possession. Meanwhile, the Mexican government, led by Santa Anna, had fled, leaving doubts regarding whom the U.S. Commissioner Mr. Trist could negotiate with. However, a temporary government was soon established at Querétaro, and negotiations for ending the war commenced. Although Trist was ordered back to Washington before final terms were agreed upon, General Scott convinced him to remain, as they were close to reaching an agreement. The treaty, known as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, was eventually signed on February 2, 1848, securing the Rio Grande as Texas's boundary, and acquiring New Mexico and Upper California for $15,000. Following the capture of Mexico City, opposition to General Scott from Generals Pillow and Worth and Colonel Duncan became evident. Scott claimed they had sought his removal from the presidency, although this was uncertain. Regardless, their hostility led to their arrest on charges of insubordination and disrespect, marking a crisis in Scott's command. A court of inquiry was convened, and shortly afterward, Scott was relieved of his command, with Major General William O. Butler assuming leadership. The selection of General Butler was generally acceptable. However, many viewed Scott's treatment as harsh and unjust, potentially fueled by his own vanity. The court's proceedings, held in Frederick, Maryland, tried both accuser and accused. Scott's career declined thereafter, with him having only nominal command of the army until 1861. Despite their mistreatment, both Scott and General Taylor became presidential candidates, with Taylor winning in 1848 and Scott losing in 1852. Chapter 3 discusses the signing of the Treaty of Peace, Mexican bullfights, regimental quartermasters, and trips to Popocatépetl and the caves of Mexico. The treaty, signed in February 1848, took time to be ratified and marked the end of significant fighting. Bullfights were a popular Sunday entertainment, though they were personally repulsive to the narrator. At these sports, there are usually from 4 to 6 bulls sacrificed. The audience occupies seats around the ring in which the exhibition is given, each seat but the foremost rising higher than the one in front, so that everyone can get a full view of the sport. When all is ready, a bull is turned into the ring. 3 or 4 men come in, mounted on the merest skeletons of horses blind or blindfolded, and so weak that they could not make a sudden turn with their riders without danger of falling down. The men are armed with spears having a point as sharp as a needle. Other men enter the arena on foot, armed with red flags and explosives about the size of a musket cartridge. To each of these explosives is fastened a barbed needle, which serves the purpose of attaching them to the bull by running the needle into the skin. Before the animal is turned loose, a lot of these explosives are attached to him. The pain from the pricking of the skin by the needles is exasperating, but when the explosions of the cartridges commence, the animal becomes frantic. As he makes a lunge towards one horseman, another runs a spear into him. He turns towards his last tormentor when a man on foot holds out a red flag. The bull rushes for this and is allowed to take it on his horns. The flag drops and covers the eyes of the animal so that he is at a loss what to do. It is jerked from him and the torment is renewed. When the animal is worked into an uncontrollable frenzy, the horsemen withdraw, and the matadors, literally murderers, enter, armed with knives having blades 12 or 18 inches long and sharp. The trick is to dodge an attack from the animal and stab him to the heart as he passes. If these efforts fail, the bull is finally lassoed, held fast, and killed by driving a knife blade into the spinal column just back of the horns. He is then dragged out by horses or mules, another is let into the ring, and the same performance is renewed. On the occasion when I was present, one of the bulls was not turned aside by the attacks in the rear, the presentations of the red flag, etc., etc., but kept right on, and placing his horns under the flanks of a horse threw him and his rider to the ground with great force. The horse was killed, and the rider lay prostrate as if dead. The bull was then lassoed and killed in the manner above described. Men came in and carried the dead man off in a litter. When the slaughtered bull and horse were dragged out, a fresh bull was turned into the ring. Conspicuous among the spectators was the man who had been carried out on a litter but a few minutes before. He was only dead so far as that performance went, but the corpse was so lively that it could not forego the chance of witnessing the discomfiture of some of his brethren who might not be so fortunate. There was a feeling of disgust manifested by the audience to find that he had come to life again. I confess that I felt sorry to see the cruelty to the bull and the horse. I did not stay for the conclusion of the performance, but while I did stay, there was not a bull killed in the prescribed way. Bullfights are now prohibited in the federal district, embracing a territory around the city of Mexico, somewhat larger than the District of Columbia, and they are not an institution in any part of the country. During one of my recent visits to Mexico, bullfights were got up in my honor at Puebla and at Pachuca. I was not notified in advance so as to be able to decline and thus prevent the performance, but in both cases I civilly declined to attend. Another amusement of the people of Mexico of that day, and one which nearly all indulged in, male and female, old and young, priest and layman, was Monte playing. Regular feast weeks were held every year at what was then known as St. Augustine Tlalpam, 11 miles out of town. There were dealers to suit every class and condition of people. In many of the booths, tlacos, the copper coin of the country, 4 of them making 6 1/4 cents of our money, were piled up in great quantities, with some silver, to accommodate the people who could not bet more than a few pennies at a time. In other booths, silver formed the bulk of the capital of the bank, with a few doubloons to be changed if there should be a run of luck against the bank. In some, there was no coin except gold. Here the rich were said to bet away their entire estates in a single day. All this is stopped now. For myself, I was kept somewhat busy during the winter of 1847-8. My regiment was stationed in Tacubaya. I was regimental quartermaster and commissary. General Scott had been unable to get clothing for the troops from the north. The men were becoming, well, they needed clothing. Material had to be purchased, such as could be obtained, and people employed to make it up into Yankee uniforms. A quartermaster in the city was designated to attend to this special duty, but clothing was so much needed that it was seized as fast as made up. A regiment was glad to get a dozen suits at a time. I had to look after this matter for the 4th Infantry. Then our regimental fund had run down, and some of the musicians in the band had been without their extra pay for a number of months. The regimental bands at that day were kept up partly by pay from the government and partly by pay from the regimental fund. There was authority of law for enlisting a certain number of men as musicians. So many could receive the pay of non-commissioned officers of the various grades, and the remainder the pay of privates. This would not secure a band leader nor good players on certain instruments. In garrison, there are various ways of keeping up a regimental fund sufficient to give extra pay to musicians, establish libraries and 10-pin alleys, subscribe to magazines, and furnish many extra comforts to the men. The best device for supplying the fund is to issue bread to the soldiers instead of flour. The ration used to be 18 ounces per day of either flour or bread, and 100 pounds of flour will make 140 pounds of bread. This saving was purchased by the commissary for the benefit of the fund. In the emergency the 4th Infantry was labouring under, I rented a bakery in the city, hired bakers, Mexicans, bought fuel and whatever was necessary, and I also got a contract from the Chief Commissary of the Army for baking a large amount of hard bread. In 2 months I made more money for the fund than my pay amounted to during the entire war. While stationed at Monterey, I had relieved the post fund in the same way. There, however, was no profit except in the saving of flour by converting it into bread. In the spring of 1848, a party of officers obtained leave to visit Popocatépetl, the highest volcano in America, and to take an escort. I went with the party, many of whom afterwards occupied conspicuous positions before the country. Of those who went south and attained high rank, there was Lieutenant Richard Anderson, who commanded a corps at Spotsylvania. Captain Sibley, a major general, and, after the war, for a number of years in the employ of the Khedive of Egypt. Captain George Crittenden, a rebel general, S.B. Buckner, who surrendered Fort Donelson, and Mansfield Lovell, who commanded at New Orleans before that city fell into the hands of the national troops. Of those who remained on our side, there were Captain Andrew Porter, Lieutenant C.P. Stone, and Lieutenant Z.B. Tower. There were quite a number of other officers whose names I cannot recollect. At a little village, Ozumba, near the base of Popocatépetl, where we purposed to commence the ascent, we procured guides and 2 pack mules with forage for our horses. High up on the mountain there was a deserted house of 1 room called the Vaqueria, which had been occupied years before by men in charge of cattle ranging on the mountain. The pasturage up there was very fine when we saw it, and there were still some cattle, descendants of the former domestic herd, which had now become wild. It was possible to go on horseback as far as the Vaqueria, though the road was somewhat hazardous in places. Sometimes it was very narrow, with a yawning precipice on one side, hundreds of feet down to a roaring mountain torrent below, and almost perpendicular walls on the other side. At one of these places one of our mules, loaded with 2 sacks of barley, one on each side, the 2 about as big as he was, struck his load against the mountain side and was precipitated to the bottom. The descent was steep but not perpendicular. The mule rolled over and over until the bottom was reached, and we supposed, of course, the poor animal was dashed to pieces. What was our surprise, not long after we had gone into bivouac, to see the lost mule, cargo, and owner coming up the ascent. The load had protected the animal from serious injury, and his owner had gone after him and found a way back to the path leading up to the hut where we were to stay. The night at the Vaqueria was one of the most unpleasant I ever knew. It was very cold, and the rain fell in torrents. A little higher up the rain ceased, and snow began. The wind blew with great velocity. The log cabin we were in had lost the roof entirely on one side, and on the other it was hardly better than a sieve. There was little or no sleep that night. As soon as it was light the next morning, we started to make the ascent to the summit. The wind continued to blow with violence, and the weather was still cloudy, but there was neither rain nor snow. The clouds, however, concealed from our view the country below us, except at times a momentary glimpse could be got through a clear space between them. The wind carried the loose snow around the mountainsides in such volumes as to make it almost impossible to stand up against it. We laboured on and on until it became evident that the top could not be reached before night, if at all in such a storm, and we concluded to return. The descent was easy and rapid, though dangerous, until we got below the snow line. At the cabin we mounted our horses, and by night were at Ozumba. The fatigues of the day and the loss of sleep the night before drove us to bed early. Our beds consisted of a place on the dirt floor with a blanket under us. Soon all were asleep, but long before morning first one and then another of our party began to cry out with excruciating pain in the eyes. Not one escaped it. By morning the eyes of half the party were so swollen that they were entirely closed. The others suffered pain equally. The feeling was about what might be expected from the prick of a sharp needle at a white heat. We remained in quarters until the afternoon, bathing our eyes in cold water. This relieved us very much, and before night the pain had entirely left. The swelling, however, continued, and about half the party still had their eyes entirely closed. But we concluded to make a start back, those who could see a little leading the horses of those who could not see at all. We moved back to the village of Ameka, some 6 miles, and stopped again for the night. The next morning all were entirely well and free from pain. The weather was clear, and Popocatépetl stood out in all its beauty, the top looking as if not a mile away, and inviting us to return. About half the party were anxious to try the ascent again, and concluded to do so. The remainder, I was with the remainder, concluded that we had got all the pleasure there was to be had out of mountain climbing, and that we would visit the great caves of Mexico, some 90 miles from where we then were, on the road to Acapulco. The party that ascended the mountain the second time succeeded in reaching the crater at the top with but little of the labour they encountered in their first attempt. 3 of them, Anderson, Stone, and Buckner, wrote accounts of their journey, which were published at the time. I made no notes of this excursion and have read nothing about it since, but it seems to me that I can see the whole of it as vividly as if it were but yesterday. I have been back at Ameka and the village beyond, twice in the last 5 years. The scene had not changed materially from my recollection of it. The party which I was with moved south down the valley to the town of Cuantla, some 40 miles from Ameka. The latter stands on the plain at the foot of Popocatépetl, at an elevation of about 8,000 feet above tide water. The slope down is gradual as the traveller moves south, but one would not judge that, in going to Cuantla, descent enough had been made to occasion a material change in the climate and productions of the soil. But such is the case. In the morning we left a temperate climate where the cereals and fruits are those common to the United States. We halted in the evening in a tropical climate where the orange and banana, the coffee and the sugar cane were flourishing. We had been travelling, apparently, on a plain all day, but in the direction of the flow of water. Soon after the capture of the city of Mexico, an armistice had been agreed to, designating the limits beyond which troops of the respective armies were not to go during its continuance. Our party knew nothing about these limits. As we approached Cuantla, bugles sounded the assembly, and soldiers rushed from the guardhouse on the edge of the town towards us. Our party halted, and I tied a white pocket handkerchief to a stick, and using it as a flag of truce, proceeded to the town. Captains Sibley and Porter followed a few hundred yards behind. I was detained at the guardhouse until a messenger could be dispatched to the quarters of the commanding general, who authorized that I should be conducted to him. I had been with the general but a few minutes when the two officers following announced themselves. The Mexican general reminded us that it was a violation of the truce for us to be there. However, as we had no special authority from our own commanding general, and as we knew nothing about the terms of the truce, we were permitted to occupy a vacant house outside the guard for the night, with the promise of a guide to put us on the road to Cuernavaca the next morning. Cuernavaca is a town west of Guantla. The country through which we passed, between these two towns, is tropical in climate and productions and rich in scenery. At one point, about halfway between the two places, the road goes over a low pass in the mountains in which there is a very quaint old town, the inhabitants of which at that day were nearly all full-blooded Indians. Very few of them even spoke Spanish. The houses were built of stone and generally only 1 story high. The streets were narrow and had probably been paved before Cortés visited the country. They had not been graded, but the paving had been done on the natural surface. We had with us one vehicle, a cart, which was probably the first wheeled vehicle that had ever passed through that town. On a hill overlooking this town stands the tomb of an ancient king, and it was understood that the inhabitants venerated this tomb very highly, as well as the memory of the ruler who was supposed to be buried in it. We ascended the mountain and surveyed the tomb, but it showed no particular marks of architectural taste, mechanical skill, or advanced civilization. The next day we went into Cuernavaca. After a day's rest at Cuernavaca, our party set out again on the journey to the great caves of Mexico. We had proceeded but a few miles when we were stopped, as before, by a guard and notified that the terms of the existing armistice did not permit us to go further in that direction. Upon convincing the guard that we were a mere party of pleasure-seekers desirous of visiting the great natural curiosities of the country which we expected soon to leave, we were conducted to a large hacienda nearby, and directed to remain there until the commanding general of that department could be communicated with, and his decision obtained as to whether we should be permitted to pursue our journey. The guard promised to send a messenger at once, and expected a reply by night. At night there was no response from the commanding general, but the captain of the guard was sure he would have a reply by morning. Again, in the morning, there was no reply. The second evening the same thing happened, and finally we learned that the guard had sent no message or messenger to the department commander. We determined, therefore, to go on unless stopped by a force sufficient to compel obedience. After a few hours' travel, we came to a town where a scene similar to the one at Cuantia occurred. The commanding officer sent a guide to conduct our party around the village and to put us upon our road again. This was the last interruption. That night we rested at a large coffee plantation, some 8 miles from the cave we were on the way to visit. It must have been a Saturday night. The peons had been paid off and spent part of the night in gambling away their scanty week's earnings. Their coin was principally copper, and I do not believe there was a man among them who had received as much as 25 cents in money. They were as much excited, however, as if they had been staking thousands. I recollect one poor fellow who had lost his last tlaco, pulled off his shirt and, in the most excited manner, put that up on the turn of a card. Monte was the game played, the place out of doors, near the window of the room occupied by the officers of our party. The next morning we were at the mouth of the cave at an early hour, provided with guides, candles and rockets. We explored to a distance of about 3 miles from the entrance, and found a succession of chambers of great dimensions and of great beauty when lit up with our rockets. Stalactites and stalagmites of all sizes were discovered. Some of the former were many feet in diameter and extended from ceiling to floor. Some of the latter were but a few feet high from the floor. But the formation is going on constantly, and many centuries hence these stalagmites will extend to the ceiling and become complete columns. The stalagmites were all a little concave, and the cavities were filled with water. The water percolates through the roof, a drop at a time, often the drops several minutes apart, and more or less charged with mineral matter. Evaporation goes on slowly, leaving the mineral behind. This in time makes the immense columns, many of them thousands of tons in weight, which serve to support the roofs over the vast chambers. I recollect that at one point in the cave, one of these columns is of such huge proportions that there is only a narrow passage left on either side of it. Some of our party became satisfied with their explorations before we had reached the point to which the guides were accustomed to take explorers, and started back without guides. Coming to the large column spoken of, they followed it entirely around, and commenced retracing their steps into the bowels of the mountain, without being aware of the fact. When the rest of us had completed our explorations, we started out with our guides, but had not gone far before we saw the torches of an approaching party. We could not conceive who these could be, for all of us had come in together, and there were none but ourselves at the entrance when we started in. Very soon we found it was our friends. It took them some time to conceive how they had got where they were. They were sure they had kept straight on for the mouth of the cave, and had gone about far enough to have reached it. My experience in the Mexican War was of great advantage to me afterwards. Besides the many practical lessons it taught, the war brought nearly all the officers of the regular army together so as to make them personally acquainted. It also brought them in contact with volunteers, many of whom served in the War of the Rebellion afterwards. Then, in my particular case, I had been at West Point at about the right time to meet most of the graduates who were of a suitable age at the breaking out of the rebellion to be trusted with large commands. Graduating in 1843, I was at the military academy from 1 to 4 years, with all cadets who graduated between 1840 and 1846, 7 classes. These classes embraced more than 50 officers who afterward became generals on one side or the other in the rebellion, many of them holding high commands. All the older officers who became conspicuous in the rebellion I had also served with and known in Mexico: Lee, J.E. Johnston, A.S. Johnston, Holmes, Hebert, and a number of others on the Confederate side, McCall, Mansfield, Phil, Kearney, and others on the national side. The acquaintance thus formed was of immense service to me in the War of the Rebellion. I mean what I learned of the characters of those to whom I was afterwards opposed. I do not pretend to say that all movements, or even many of them, were made with special reference to the characteristics of the commander against whom they were directed. But my appreciation of my enemies was certainly affected by this knowledge. The natural disposition of most people is to clothe a commander of a large army whom they do not know with almost superhuman abilities. A large part of the National Army, for instance, and most of the press of the country, clothed General Lee with just such qualities, but I had known him personally and knew that he was mortal, and it was just as well that I felt this. The Treaty of Peace was at last ratified, and the evacuation of Mexico by United States troops was ordered. Early in June, the troops in the City of Mexico began to move out. Many of them, including the brigade to which I belonged, were assembled at Jalapa, above the Vomito, to await the arrival of transports at Vera Cruz. But with all this precaution, my regiment and others were in camp on the sand beach in a July sun for about a week before embarking, while the fever raged with great virulence in Vera Cruz, not 2 miles away. I can call to mind only one person, an officer, who died of the disease. My regiment was sent to Pascagoula, Mississippi, to spend the summer. As soon as it was settled in camp, I obtained a leave of absence for 4 months and proceeded to St. Louis. On the 22nd of August, 1848, I was married to Miss Julia Dent, the lady of whom I have before spoken. We visited my parents and relations in Ohio, and at the end of my leave, proceeded to my post at Sackett's Harbor, New York. In April following, I was ordered to Detroit, Michigan, where 2 years were spent with but few important incidents. The present Constitution of the state of Michigan was ratified during this time. By the terms of one of its provisions, all citizens of the United States residing within the state at the time of the ratification became citizens of Michigan also. During my stay in Detroit, there was an election for city officers. Mr. Zachariah Chandler was the candidate of the Whigs for the office of mayor, and was elected, although the city was then reckoned democratic. All the officers stationed there at the time who offered their votes were permitted to cast them. I did not offer mine, however, as I did not wish to consider myself a citizen of Michigan. This was Mr. Chandler's first entry into politics, a career he followed ever after with great success, and in which he died enjoying the friendship, esteem, and love of his countrymen. In the spring of 1851, the garrison at Detroit was transferred to Sackett's Harbor, and in the following spring the entire 4th Infantry was ordered to the Pacific coast. It was decided that Mrs. Grant should visit my parents at first for a few months, and then remain with her own family at their St. Louis home until an opportunity offered of sending for her. In the month of April, the regiment was assembled at Governor's Island, New York Harbor, and on the 5th of July 8 companies sailed for Aspinwall. We numbered a little over 700 persons, including the families of officers and soldiers. Passage was secured for us on the old steamer Ohio, commanded at the time by Captain Schenck of the Navy. It had not been determined until a day or two before starting that the 4th Infantry should go by the Ohio. Consequently, a complement of passengers had already been secured. The addition of over 700 to this list crowded the steamer most uncomfortably, especially for the tropics in July. In 8 days, Aspinwall was reached. At that time, the streets of the town were 8 or 10 inches under water, and foot passengers passed from place to place on raised footwalks. July is at the height of the wet season on the isthmus. At intervals, the rain would pour down in streams, followed in not many minutes by a blazing tropical summer's sun. These alternate changes from rain to sunshine were continuous in the afternoons. I wondered how any person could live many months in Aspinwall, and wondered still more why anyone tried. In the summer of 1852, the Panama Railroad was completed only to the point where it now crosses the Chagres River. From there, passengers were carried by boats to Gorgona, at which place they took mules for Panama, some 25 miles further. Those who travelled over the isthmus in those days will remember that boats on the Chagres River were propelled by natives not inconveniently burdened with clothing. These boats carried 30 to 40 passengers each. The crews consisted of 6 men to a boat, armed with long poles. There were planks wide enough for a man to walk on conveniently, running along the sides of each boat from end to end. The men would start from the bow, place one end of their poles against the river bottom, brace their shoulders against the other end, and then walk to the stern as rapidly as they could. In this way, from a mile to a mile and a half an hour could be made, against the current of the river. I, as regimental quartermaster, had charge of the public property, and had also to look after the transportation. A contract had been entered into with the steamship company in New York for the transportation of the regiment to California, including the Isthmus transit. A certain amount of baggage was allowed per man, and saddle animals were to be furnished to commissioned officers and to all disabled persons. The regiment, with the exception of one company left as guards to the public property, camp and garrison equipage principally, and the soldiers with families, took boats propelled as above described for Gorgona. From this place they marched to Panama, and were soon comfortably on the steamer anchored in the bay, some 3 or 4 miles from the town. I, with one company of troops and all the soldiers with families, all the tents, mess chests, and camp kettles, was sent to Cruces, a town a few miles higher up the Chagres River than Gorgona. There I found an impecunious American who had taken the contract to furnish transportation for the regiment at a stipulated price per £100 for the freight, and so much for each saddle animal. But when we reached Cruces, there was not a mule, either for pack or saddle, in the place. The contractor promised that the animals should be on hand in the morning. In the morning he said that they were on the way from some imaginary place, and would arrive in the course of the day. This went on until I saw that he could not procure the animals at all at the price he had promised to furnish them for. The unusual number of passengers that had come over on the steamer and the large amount of freight to pack had created an unprecedented demand for mules. Some of the passengers paid as high as $40 for the use of a mule to ride 25 miles, when the mule would not have sold for $10 in that market at other times. Meanwhile, the cholera had broken out, and men were dying every hour. To diminish the food for the disease, I permitted the company detailed with me to proceed to Panama. The captain and the doctors accompanied the men, and I was left alone with the sick and the soldiers who had families. The regiment at Panama was also affected with the disease, but there were better accommodations for the well on the steamer and a hospital for those taken with the disease on an old hulk anchored a mile off. There were also hospital tents on shore on the island of Flamingo, which stands in the bay. I was about a week at Cruces before transportation began to come in. About 1/3 of the people with me died, either at Cruces or on the way to Panama. There was no agent of the transportation company at Cruces to consult, or to take the responsibility of procuring transportation at a price which would secure it. I therefore myself dismissed the contractor and made a new contract with a native at more than double the original price. Thus we finally reached Panama. The steamer, however, could not proceed until the cholera abated, and the regiment was detained still longer. Altogether, on the Isthmus and on the Pacific side, we were delayed 6 weeks. About 1/7 of those who left New York Harbor with the 4th Infantry on the 5th of July now lie buried on the Isthmus of Panama or on Flamingo Island in Panama Bay. One amusing circumstance occurred while we were lying at anchor in Panama Bay. In the regiment there was a Lieutenant Slaughter who was very liable to seasickness. It almost made him sick to see the wave of a tablecloth when the servants were spreading it. Soon after his graduation, Slaughter was ordered to California and took passage by a sailing vessel going around Cape Horn. The vessel was 7 months making the voyage, and Slaughter was sick every moment of the time, never more so than while lying at anchor after reaching his place of destination. On landing in California, he found orders which had come by the Isthmus, notifying him of a mistake in his assignment. He should have been ordered to the northern lakes. He started back by the Isthmus route and was sick all the way. But when he arrived at the east, he was again ordered to California, this time definitely, and at this date was making his 3rd trip. He was as sick as ever, and had been so for more than a month while lying at anchor in the bay. I remember him well, seated with his elbows on the table in front of him, his chin between his hands, and looking the picture of despair. At last he broke out, "I wish I had taken my father's advice. He wanted me to go into the Navy. If I had done so, I should not have had to go to sea so much." Poor Slaughter. It was his last sea voyage. He was killed by Indians in Oregon. By the last of August, the cholera had so abated that it was deemed safe to start. The disease did not break out again on the way to California, and we reached San Francisco early in September. San Francisco at that day was a lively place. Gold, or placer digging as it was called, was at its height. Steamers plied daily between San Francisco and both Stockton and Sacramento. Passengers and gold from the southern mines came by the Stockton boat, from the northern mines by Sacramento. In the evening when these boats arrived, Long Wharf, there was but one wharf in San Francisco in 1852, was alive with people crowding to meet the miners as they came down to sell their dust and to have a time. Of these, some were runners for hotels, boarding houses or restaurants. Others belonged to a class of impecunious adventurers, of good manners and good presence, who were ever on the alert to make the acquaintance of people with some ready means, in the hope of being asked to take a meal at a restaurant. Many were young men of good family, good education, and gentlemanly instincts. Their parents had been able to support them during their minority and to give them good educations, but not to maintain them afterwards. From 1849 to 1853, there was a rush of people to the Pacific coast of the class described. All thought that fortunes were to be picked up without effort in the gold fields on the Pacific. Some realized more than their most sanguine expectations, but for one such there were hundreds disappointed, many of whom now fill unknown graves, Others died wrecks of their former selves, and many, without a vicious instinct, became criminals and outcasts. Many of the real scenes in early California life exceed in strangeness and interest any of the mere products of the brain of the novelist. Those early days in California brought out character. It was a long way off then, and the journey was expensive. The fortunate could go by Cape Horn or by the Isthmus of Panama, but the mass of pioneers crossed the plains with their ox teams. This took an entire summer. They were very lucky when they got through with a yoke of worn-out cattle. All other means were exhausted in procuring the outfit on the Missouri River. The immigrant, on arriving, found himself a stranger in a strange land, far from friends. Time pressed, for the little means that could be realized from the sale of what was left of the outfit would not support a man long at California prices. Many became discouraged. Others would take off their coats and look for a job, no matter what it might be. These succeeded as a rule. There were many young men who had studied professions before they went to California, and who had never done a day's manual labor in their lives, who took in the situation at once and went to work to make a start at anything they could get to do. Some supplied carpenters and masons with material, carrying plank, brick, or mortar, as the case might be. Others drove stages, drays, or baggage wagons until they could do better. More became discouraged early and spent their time looking up people who would treat, or lounging about restaurants and gambling houses where free lunches were furnished daily. They were welcomed at these places because they often brought in miners who proved good customers. My regiment spent a few weeks at Benicia Barracks and then was ordered to Fort Vancouver on the Columbia River, then in Oregon Territory. During the winter of 1852-3, the territory was divided, all north of the Columbia River being taken from Oregon to make Washington Territory. Prices for all kinds of supplies were so high on the Pacific coast from 1849 until at least 1853 that it would have been impossible for officers of the army to exist upon their pay if it had not been that authority was given them to purchase from the commissary such supplies as he kept at New Orleans wholesale prices. A cook could not be hired for the pay of a captain. The cook could do better. At Benicia in 1852, flour was 25 cents per pound, potatoes were 16 cents, beets, turnips and cabbage 6 cents, onions 37.12 cents, meat and other articles in proportion. In 1853 at Vancouver, vegetables were a little lower. I, with 3 other officers, concluded that we would raise a crop for ourselves, and by selling the surplus realize something handsome. I bought a pair of horses that had crossed the plains that summer and were very poor. They recuperated rapidly, however, and proved a good team to break up the ground with. I performed all the labor of breaking up the ground while the other officers planted the potatoes. Our crop was enormous. Luckily for us, the Columbia River rose to a great height from the melting of the snow in the mountains in June, and overflowed and killed most of our crop. This saved digging it up, for everybody on the Pacific coast seemed to have come to the conclusion at the same time that agriculture would be profitable. In 1853, more than 3/4 of the potatoes raised were permitted to rot in the ground, or had to be thrown away. The only potatoes we sold were to our own mess. While I was stationed on the Pacific coast, we were free from Indian wars. There were quite a number of remnants of tribes in the vicinity of Portland in Oregon and of Fort Vancouver in Washington Territory. They had generally acquired some of the vices of civilization, but none of the virtues, except in individual cases. The Hudson's Bay Company had held the Northwest with their trading posts for many years before the United States was represented on the Pacific coast. They still retained posts along the Columbia River and one at Fort Vancouver when I was there. Their treatment of the Indians had brought out the better qualities of the savages. Farming had been undertaken by the company to supply the Indians with bread and vegetables. They raised some cattle and horses, and they had now taught the Indians to do the labor of the farm and herd. They always compensated them for their labor, and always gave them goods of uniform quality and at uniform price. Before the advent of the American, The medium of exchange between the Indian and the white man was pelts. Afterward, it was silver coin. If an Indian received in the sale of a horse a $50 gold piece, not an infrequent occurrence, the first thing he did was to exchange it for American half-dollars.